I'd like to express my appreciation to the organizers of this event and to everyone who is here. And I know that Saudi Arabia and democracy are usually not two ideas that we think of together. But what I would like to do is to suggest that rather than just thinking strictly about democracy as an implementation of elections and institutions, that we take a deeper look at how citizenship is being built inside the kingdom as perhaps a more useful tool for gauging the will to and desire for change, particularly as visions of citizens are fluctuating, I would argue, between looking at them as subjects, objects, and even agents in nation building. And the twin pillars of Saudi citizenship that King Abdullah had really projected as first as crown prince and then as king following 9/11 had to do with wasatiyya as moderation and wataniyya as love of nation. And the goal there was to really think about what it means to be a citizen. There are some who've questioned who therefore has the right to interpret and implement religious teachings and practice. And we've also seen the addition of new voices outside of the religious establishment that are entering into conversation, such as the voices of women, youth, and Shia in some cases. And that means that they are challenging the prior apparent monopoly of the religious establishment over the interpretation and implementation of religion and religious values in both the public and private domains. They've also been demanding recognition of alternative narratives and interpretations that do not necessarily have as their primary objective the upholding of state policies. And so what we see is negotiation and renegotiation of the boundaries between the religious and the political, reflecting fluidity and creating barriers at the same time as the state and those who are opposed to it engage in cooperation and confrontation, oftentimes using religion to frame, legitimate, and reimagine the twin projects of citizenship and nationhood. Briefly, the government program of wasatiyya was designed to promote a middle-of-the-road interpretation of Islam geared toward community building, ethics, and harmony. And because the government is the main proponent of that vision, the government therefore held the upper hand in determining what constituted correct interpretation. And the goal was to connect wasatiyya with wataniyya, that a moderate religious identity was supposed to be a central aspect of post-9/11 citizenship in order to override other identities that have tended to segment society: tribal affiliation, client networks, regionalism, and even sectarianism. Wasatiyya was intended to promote the creation of citizens who were moderate in their views. It's not necessarily a program for democratization. The driving need behind wasatiyya was the state's confrontation with extremism, defined as the use of violence to achieve political goals. And because the government claims the exclusive right to the use of violence, the reality of wasatiyya really is that it has been intended to bolster the state's exclusive right to both the use of violence and political decision-making. In other words, it's designed to maintain the government in its current position of power, precluding the potential for either civil war or revolution on the one hand, or full democratization on the other. And therefore, any challenge to that government monopoly on violence or policymaking is addressed as a security threat that has to be met with the proverbial iron fist. Much of this wasatiyya program is designed to offer what has been referred to as performative practices. So wasatiyya is not just supposed to be about the government telling people how to behave and theological theorizing, but it's intended to have an impact and to be embodied and expressed in real-life settings. The performance of this wasatiyya before many publics is supposed to help change social mentalities. And yet the challenge remains that although a government can tell its people that they need to be moderate in their thinking and even their religious practice, it's another thing entirely for people to actually do it. One example that we might look to as a means of trying to construct a new Saudi identity would be the King Abdullah Scholarship Program begun in 2005 that was intended to send students abroad, not simply to acquire an education, but more importantly to acquire experience of other countries, other cultures, other societies in order to create a body of citizens ready to lead Saudi Arabia into the 21st century. And I mention this program because it is now in danger of facing very serious budget cuts in 2016 that was recently announced. The question is, who's going to feel the cuts first? Will women and Shia be cut out of the scholarship program first in order to prioritize men, or will there be some other vetting process? Perhaps the most complicated challenges with respect to Wasatiyah are the need to be faithful to Islam and respect Saudi heritage and culture while also addressing 21st century needs. And the government has said on the one hand that extremism will no longer be permitted at any level of the official religious establishment. Anybody found to be supporting or promoting extremist ideology is to be dismissed. And yet at the same time, we have these other two principles that remain in place. Promotion of virtue and prevention of vice is, of course, the foundational purpose of the Hayya, the religious police. And you also have this continued idea of preaching loyalty and disavowal to anybody not adhering to correct doctrines. And so there is this tension that lies between, on the one hand, official opposition to extremism and leaving in place these other concepts that would seem to promote extremism on the other hand. The government has been trying to exert greater control over religious voices by monitoring Friday sermons, distributing prepared texts, and issuing fatwas in order to assure that moderation permeates society. But critics have charged it really just introduces a new level of censorship and robs interpreters of any ability to engage in agency, so that extremism necessarily remains in the picture. And perhaps nowhere are these challenges clearer than with the Saudi state's attempts to deal with their Shia population. Shia are variously described as Iranian agents, terrorists within, apostates, political dissidents, partners in national dialogue, targets and objects of development projects, and aspiring students and citizens. In other words, it's a very confusing mix, and depending on the day or who is giving the description, you may be a subject, an object, or an agent. And it also raises the issue that the identity of Saudi Shia, therefore, is never constant, and it is not necessarily a matter of self-perception. It's one that is projected onto them by the government, by the rest of the country, and is very context-dependent. It also denies the idea of the Saudi Shia ever being able to engage in their own agency in determining their identity for themselves. And I would say that that position is untenable in current circumstances because Shia may not necessarily identify primarily or terminally as Shia, but may identify more with youth movements or by gender. We do see this ongoing theological tension between Sunnis and Shias that has relegated Shia to secondary status overall. Although there had been some attempts to try to further incorporate Shia into the national dialogue, at the same time, the government monopoly on historical narratives and religious narratives has left them to the side. And so even though there was a moment of hope for greater inclusiveness, specifically between 2009 and 2011, that hope seems since then to have died. In many places, the Arab Spring was supposed to be a breath of fresh air, and yet what we found is that the uprising in Al-Awamiyah created more problems for the Shia than they have solutions, because the idea of demonstrating, of course, was prohibited, and that prohibition was repeated by the religious establishment. And that seems to have brought about a resurgence of anti-Shia rhetoric, not only at the government level, but very pervasively in the media. And we saw this play out most prominently with the arrest and trial and ultimate execution of Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr as the most important and only Shia sheikh who continued to support the uprisings. And I would argue that this actually created the space for these 2015 bombings that Kamran was referring to earlier, that one of the moments of hope that actually came out of those bombings was the initial response of the Saudi public. After the first bombing, that regardless of what people thought about the Shia, the reality was that these people were bombed during their Friday prayers, and that was considered to be unacceptable. And so you had massive engagement of support by both Sunnis and Shia at the funerals of those who were killed in those mosque attacks. It's popular to look at the events of the Arab Spring as a turning point in the Middle East, but I think in the case of Saudi Arabia, what we really have is the floods that hit Jeddah in 2000 and 2011 that I point to as having resulted in a change in social mentality. We know that hundreds of people were killed, and the level of destruction that occurred was quite horrific. And for citizens, subjects who had been raised with the expectation of government welfare, people called the emergency services expecting somebody to come and rescue them, except there was nobody there. Because this happened right at the tail end of the Hajj season, and so all of the emergency services were actually busy helping the Hajj pilgrims and were not available to come and rescue people from the floods. And people had to start taking matters into their own hands. If they wanted to be saved, they were going to have to save themselves. If they wanted to provide medical services, they were going to have to do it on their own. And that meant that anybody who could help did, anybody who could help drive did, whether you were male or female. Anybody who knew how to swim helped out with rescues and organization. And I think that that has resulted in a recognition that if citizens are going to have to do more in order to help themselves, if you can't just count on the government to do things for you, then that means that you have the right to demand more from the government. With the uprising of the Shia youth, and I'm sorry, I'm racing through this. We got cut down to 10 minutes, so I'll be happy to take questions at the end. But I think that some of the main lessons that have come out of the uprisings for Shia youth in particular are some of the terms that we've heard elsewhere in the discourse of the Arab Spring, and this has nothing to do really with religion. It has to do with human rights. And the building more of a desire to build a more civil society. We have seen Sunni and Shia youth learning to work together. We've also seen Shia youth refusing to stop their protests unless their demands are met. And I think part of the message that they are sending is that the years of co-optation are over. They will end their protests only when the government meets their demands with substantive and tangible action. They are done with concerns about saving face, using proper channels, social taboos about causing disruption. They may be willing to respect certain boundaries, but they do expect results. In other words, this wasatiyah has to be a two-way street. It's not just the government telling people that they have to be moderate. The citizenry is demanding a moderate response to their demands as well. And so I think the real question for the future is the degree to which citizens will be able to engage more fully in this program of wasatiyah and wataniyah. It's stuck, but perhaps not necessarily in the way that the government had intended. And I also think it will be very important in the future to see whether identity construction will remain along negative lines in terms of identity of difference, what we are not, how other people are different from us, and perhaps might shift to a more positive construction at looking at who we are and what we want this nation to look like and what we want our vested role to be like. Thank you.